Ardle is an associate lecturer in classical studies at the Open University, and I'm going to hand over to him now because it's bang on 7 o'clock.
Excellent, thank you, Cheryl. I think it's pronounced Holconii as well, so we'll both argue over that or not. Okay, so what I want to do is sort of continue a little bit on people of Pompeii from what I did with Eumachia. So this is going to take a slightly different angle. It might digress a little bit into different areas, but hopefully you'll see the logic in what I'm trying to do. So I've probably overdone it a little bit, but still, hopefully it'll give you a little interest in the sources that we have from Pompeian interpretations of that, but also give a bit of a window into how some of these people have been interpreted in the past. So, okay, the Holconii, it's the genus Holconia. It's thought to have been long established in Campania in the area of Pompeii. So I thought this was a nice image, of vines growing just around the amphitheater in Pompeii. So what is the actual evidence for that? Because it is important trying to establish, what is the sort of long established families in Pompeii, which hopefully will come clear a little bit later on. And it seems to be based upon these two literary sources, one from Pliny the Elder, also another one from Columelia. Now, they refer to vine growing, hence the sort of scenic image I showed a little bit earlier on. And they refer to the Horconian sort of variety of wine, grapes that has been linked in to the Holconii family. So the suggestion is the Holconii family, the genus Holconia, got their wealth and their establishment within Campania and Pompeii through growing vines. Now, you will see different interpretations in relation to whether this might be a transcript error in the original manuscripts or something like that. But you can see there is a variation in spelling. But this is where much of the sort of origin of where the Holconia is supposed to come from and the discussion in relation to their sort of longevity in the particular area. And but the other thing is, sort of helps a little bit with that, is there doesn't seem to be any other evidence for any sort of Holconii elsewhere in the area of Campania. But this is sort of where we establish the sort of longevity of the family and where they sort of become a sort of established family in the area. So this comes back to a question that Cheryl asked me a little bit earlier before when I was talking about this particular talk, is about the social war, which is not very social, the civil wars that took place, put in here, 91 to 87 BC. The Pompeians chose the wrong side, or at least they chose the side that went against Rome. So we need to remember the Italian peninsula was not united as part of the Roman Empire as yet. So a lot of these establishments around, including Pompeii, were allies. And as it says here, and a little bit in blue at the latter part here, saying they felt they've been doing a lot for the Romans and they would like to have Roman citizenship. So the Romans thought, well, Roman citizenship, well, no, we could find that to ourselves. So there is a bit of a civil war over the whole thing and a little bit of disquiet. But this brings about another character, which is a really important character, particularly in terms of the establishment, what ultimately will become Imperial Pompeii, is this chap called Sulla. Now, Sulla, also known as Felix, is one of those that becomes one of the dictators of Rome, and he besieges Pompeii in 89 BC. So we do have some evidence for that, and I thought I'd show you a little bit of that evidence. I'm really going to focus on Tower 10, but Tower 11 is quite an interesting one. That's the Tower of Mercury. If you might listen to one of my talks on relation to the Allied bombing of Pompeii, seemingly there was a German anti-aircraft guns were established on the top of that, but I haven't been able to see any images of that, but just a digression slightly there. And as I said to you, I'm going to focus on Tower 10. And this is in the sort of the entrance to Vesuvius, and focusing on this little dot there, which you probably can't necessarily see, but you'll see in a minute. In this dot here, some further dots, more dots. So there's lots of these dots in the wall, and they have been interpreted as being part of would it be termed ballista? But sort of like cannonballs, obviously not cannonballs, but when fired up against the wall, and that's been damage against the wall itself. And it only seems to be on the southern walls of Pompeii. These have been collected not just from, I suppose, in front of the walls in Pompeii, but also in some of the houses were excavated in that facility. So it does seem that there was an effort to actually really physically besiege the place. What is interesting is this inscription. Inscription is, it's partial, um, and this is how it's been fully interpreted. And this refers to the rebuilding of the wall and towers along the southern part, presuming it's the southern part. And this is estimated to be around 70 BC. And it's found within a household, but it's also found reused in a household. So it was no longer displayed, and that would explain its sort of partial nature, but some of the deep holes in which seems to have been used as a threshold to a doorway. I'll give you an indication as to where it is. See, it's very much in the center of Pompeii. Giving a look and using Google Earth, which I've been playing with quite a lot recently. But this is the actual house itself, and it was found in the peristyle area, the sort of rear gardenish area, so it was reused there. So this is the house, the easiest one to say, the house of Mars and Venus. But not only just to show you that evidence and its reuse, but I thought it was also quite interesting, this household. You can see this is the doorway into it, which is, I suppose, is fairly obvious to it in this case. And you can see the lock there on the left hand side, but this is the entrance going into it, the fasces of the vestibule. And I want you to focus not just on the nice pretty dolphins there and the other sort of nautical sort of features and the trident, but up towards the top part. The top part is this bit here. So in some ways, that's sort of marking a boundary between perhaps the public and private part of the household, or not really fully private, because the atrium is a place where people go into. And you can see the walls over here. And I suppose when I was amusing myself when I was putting this together, because of Six Nations rugby was taking place, you see these sort of rugby ball shaped things. So I thought it was quite interesting. We have this inscription that is referring to the reconstruction, or at least the fixing up of walls and towers. And we see have this image that's on the in the entrance going into it. So I'm assuming these are not rugby balls. As far as I know, rugby wasn't invented at that stage. So maybe these are the ballista balls that were fired up against it. But it's always just an interesting coincidence between the two, and perhaps it is a coincidence. Maybe it is just intentional, but maybe I'm perhaps over-interpreting this, but I just thought it was quite interesting, the two aspects linked within this one building. So that's in reference to the siege. Ultimately, Pompeii becomes a colony. And a colony is the highest level status of settlement when we're looking at the hierarchy of towns in the Roman Empire. And it gets its names changed, and it becomes Colonia, Cornelia, Verena, Pompeianum. So ultimately, it's named after Sulla. And Sulla had, as far as he was, as a patron deity, is Venus, so hence the Veneria. And that gets established in 80 BC. So the picture here in the background is the chap who we all know is Cicero, or Scipio, or not Scipio, Cicero. See, my Latin's so terrible. But he was also part of, or at least involved in the armies that were moving around in Pompeii. I think he might have been there at the siege. He does get rewarded with some land in the area, so he does have a connection with Pompeii, not necessarily directly within the settlement itself, as far as we know, but because we got a lot of literary sources for him, it's often sort of quite tempting to make connections to it. But anyway, Sulla goes off and does his Sulla thing. Cicero goes and does his Cicero thing, talking about how great he is. But another chap that gets involved in Pompeii is Publius Cornelius Sulla. And he is the nephew of Sulla, the person who actually laid siege to the place. And he becomes a patron of Pompeii. So he's doing his things. I think Sulla passes away, and his nephew is involved in politics in Rome. Wants to become a consul. The consul is the highest level, political level within Rome itself, and there's a bit of a scandal, and he gets kicked out of that role. So he's obviously a little bit annoyed about that. And he meets up with a few disgruntled other individuals, such as Catiline. Now, he gets involved not necessarily directly in relation to it, but depending on, how we're looking at the literary sources. But the Catiline conspiracy takes place in 63 BC. And luckily, Cicero is the great savior. Again, one of those interesting sort of connections between the two, and we have Pliny the Elder, who we met a little bit earlier on, talks about a town councillor gets hit by lightning. So this is obviously not Pompeii, but hopefully gives the impression of what I'm trying to get across. And it's sort of interesting sort of bad omen that takes place. So obviously the Catiline conspiracy is a bad thing. So we have Publius Cornelius Sulla gets involved, and he gets accused of being part of the active campaign, which is an armed revolt against Rome itself. And he eventually gets Cicero to support him and do a speech pro Sulla in 62 BC, and that's ultimately in defense of him. He is charged with conspiracy and incitement. Everyone else that seems to have been associated with Publius Cornelius Sulla seems to get convicted, but Cicero gets him off. So it's a victory for him. So why am I sort of slightly digressing here? Going back to the point I said to you about a colony. So the colony is established, it's a legal status, but also colonists would be established in Pompeii. So these colonists would obviously be those that are connected to Sulla, and there would be a reward for being involved in his campaigns and his military activities. I already mentioned about Cicero being rewarded with a nice villa in the area. So they might have replaced the elite, the aristocracy in Pompeii. And that was very much the tradition in much people, how they looked at Pompeii and the history of Pompeii. And looking at where the evidence for that does come from Cicero's Prosolia. And in this case, you can see that he mentions the colonists here, and he talks a little bit. He's talking about he's one of the patrons of the place, and he's at odds with there's disagreement between the new settlers and the colonists about control in Pompeii, and some of them are not necessarily feeling that Sulla is defending. These are the cases that have been brought against Sulla. And Cicero's answer into this is that both the inhabitants of Pompeii, whether they're colonists and whether they're the original individuals there, both come together in support of Sulla because Sulla has been supporting them and has been a suitable patron. So this does move away from that extreme position that was often thought about, is that the elite, the aristocracy, the original aristocracy were completely removed. I'm not suggesting that there wasn't a change, but I think it's in practical terms, it'd be very difficult for the ruling elite to be completely removed, but certainly those that were more compliant in relation to Sulla would have hung on. And I'm trying to suggest that one of those groups would have been the Holconii. So this is not my work, but this is people who've been studying the various names in relation to looking at the magistrates and candidates in the early part of the colony. It does seem to suggest there is a little bit of a balance in favour of the colonists, but still you can see the Pompeian originals, presumably also the Holconii, were also still involved in Pompeii. So whether they sort of bought back into Pompeii, we don't know, but they're still in existence in Pompeian politics. So, moving ahead to the important period, which I'm going to be mostly focusing on, is the period of Augustus. And this is really a period in which Pompeii seems to thrive. And this is the time when the Holconii seem to be making a dramatic political statement. And you can imagine that when you talk about that, it seems quite dramatic, but Augustus was in command of the Roman Empire for quite a substantial period of time, which probably over around, was it 30, 40 years, um, which is a long period of time, one of probably the longest, if not one of the longest reigning emperors. So you can imagine quite a lot would have taken place in this time. So bringing us on to Marcus Holconius Rufus, and it's going to be this gentleman who I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about, because he is the individual we seem to have most of the evidence for. So this is not necessarily a great image, but here we can see his name is being referred to, Marcus Holconius Rufus, and much what I'll be talking about is looking at this individual. And you can see here, he's referred to his name and some of the activities involved with. There's a term that I've underlined here in blue and put in bold, a dumver, which is one of the sort of almost on a sort of, make a parallel to the city of Rome, is the sort of consul. So it's the highest level, the highest political level within Pompeii. What's also interesting is the lower part here is the name Colonia Veneria Cornelia is mentioned in this actual inscription. Now we'll come back to this, but I just want to show that one of the earliest inscriptions we got for this individual, a Pompeian individual, is in a very senior political position in Pompeii. So again, a sort of further digression, and it can be quite complex. I'm not going to go into huge detail. The real reason for that is not that I'm trying to be dismissive of you, it's because I will get confused and I don't want to make a fool of myself. But talk a little bit briefly about Pompeian local government. So I'm going to focus around the sort of forum area, which you could imagine is sort of the main administrative area, and looking at these sort of structures over here, just the bottom of the forum, to the right, and the lower part of the forum over to the south area. Briefly talk about these buildings and try to relate these to political office. Again, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, and it is a question of interpretation, but hopefully it gives a little bit of life to some of these buildings for those of you who've already been to Pompeii, or those of you who will be going to Pompeii, just to think about the purpose of these particular structures. So, three political institutions, it says here: the magistrates, who have talked a little bit about it. I talked about the Dumver, where they were a magistrate, is a comitium, and the Ordo Decuriorum. The magistrates thing I'm going to be talking most about, and they're divided up into two different alphas. I already talked about one, which is the senior one, the Dumvirate, but the Aediles, which is sort of junior level. And Dumvers were really those ones that sort of presided over everything in relation to the Ordo, which is like the sort of political assembly, the councillors, and the Comitium is where the people, as I said here, about the free individuals of Pompeii, the citizens of Pompeii, would come together and vote. Every 5 years, the Dumvers would get a special name, and they would refer to looking after the official census of all the citizens of Pompeii. So this is where, if you are already served as a Dumver, this is where you would sort of reach the highest level in relation to that. So that's the seniorest level of political office in Pompeii. So the Comitium, which I showed you already a little bit earlier on, over here towards the left, is an open space. And that open space is where the citizens would gather, male citizens, free citizens of Pompeii would come together. And this is where they would come together and make their decision in terms of who would become Aedile and who might become the Dumver. So this sounds very democratic, but obviously it's much more complex than that, because it's all related to the patron-client relationship. But, it's still, there's no such thing as a perfect democracy, but they would have been influenced by their patrons or particular groups and to who to vote for. The number of people that would make up the actual town council seems to be around a maximum of 100, but it's unlikely that would ever have reached 100. But it was important for the Dumver to make and the councils to make a decision as to every 5 years as to who was actually sort of part of that town council. So this is looking at the Comitium from the forum, and it seems to be easy access to get into the area. An open space, which you'd imagine if this where the citizens were assembling. Over towards the left, there does seem to be sort of almost like a stage area. And you can see it over there just beside the hut. The hut is obviously modern-ish. And there has been some excavations done by a German archaeological team, this sort of ground penetrating radar, to see what was originally on the site. And you can see these rectangles in the northern part. And these northern part seems to have been shops. And this Comitium seems to have been constructed as a space, an open space during the Augustan period, in replacement of a house. But around the area was both the north and the south, the area facing into, or not into the south, and towards facing the east, all seems to have been shops. So they get replaced, and this seems to parallel the area around the Forum, where the Eumachia building was. That ultimately replaces shops that were surrounding the Forum area. So it becomes sort of much more a political space. So what I want to move from the Comitium area, I suppose I should make a parallel a little bit with the Eumachia building. The elections for these positions take place in March of every year. So the building would have been left for its own devices for a whole year and nothing else. So it's unlikely that would have been the case. It probably would have been used for other activities, maybe marketplace and things like that. But during the time of elections, it will be taken over for elections. So it could also just been a pleasant place for people to walk in, but it's easily accessible, much more easily accessible than the Umacchia building, which also probably was used for markets or other sort of social gatherings. So what I want to move down now to is the three structures to the south of the Forum. This is to the right. I'm just showing an image of the German archaeological investigation showing that these various statue bases that they've sort of found that in addition to the ones we are already aware of. So it's quite a dynamic space. I'm going to focus on these three structures, and these also seem to have been developed quite late around the Forum area. It seems to be similar time to the Comitium, and the replacement of domestic dwellings. We're not sure of the plan of them because the excavation isn't very extensive, which you could imagine, because it's still a very important tourist site. So they're sort of hypothetical, but they were originally domestic structures, became these public buildings. Unfortunately, when these were excavated, it was very early, and at the same time wouldn't necessarily gone through the same archaeological techniques that we use in modern days. So we're not necessarily sure exactly of the function of the building, but certain aspects have been attributed to them. So I'm going to follow through a little bit on that narrative, give you a little bit of my own opinion, but in reality, the evidence for the exact function of these buildings is quite difficult to say firmly. But it is interesting, if you look at this plan, the two buildings, the one to the left and the central one, are very much focused on position in relation to the Forum below. You can see the colonnade of the Forum just below them. So looking at the first building here, this, as I said to you, was very early excavations, 1814, 1826, an open area. You can see an asp at the back area, and flanking either side of that from the German archaeological excavation might have been statues there. And for those of you know your Italian better than I do, you can see that this has been designated as an administration building and ultimately a place, or the room of the magistrates. So that I mentioned by the Dumver and the Aediles were both considered to be magistrates. So there's very little within the structure itself that gives us an indication as to its function, but it is an impressive building, very much open into the Forum area. So I would be quite happy to go along with the idea that this is where the magistrates came together and they did their activities. Now, these are 4 individuals, but they would have had a supporting team around them, so they would have needed a reasonably biggish space. But again, how that all function together, I don't necessarily know. Moving into the sort of central area, very different in terms of the shape of the building. So there's architecturally quite, each of these are reasonably unique. And in this case, we've got a nice sort of almost like a podium stairs going into it. And it's more impressive in some ways. You've got almost like a stage at the back, but you've got all these areas towards the left and right. And it's been suggested the function of this building would have been for storage and storage for the archives for Pompeii. So you can imagine quite a lot of administrative documentation that would have been built up. So it would be quite appropriate for that to be quite close to where the magistrates would have been working. Then moving further over towards the right hand side, which is separated by an alleyway. And the suggestion is that if there's a lot of papers or flammable material that's in the archive, it's wise to have these separated at least by a firewall, but they didn't do it for the other structures. So I'll go along with that argument to some extent, but not necessarily fully. But this one here, again, has been designated as an administrator, unlike the other 2 structures I already mentioned, but related to the Aediles. Now, I prefer to see this as been perhaps where the Ordo or the town council met. The reason why I'm suggesting that is because it's got a fancy floor and it seems to have lots of niches. A niche there at the back, niche there on the left and right. So this probably would have been where statues are, and it seems to me a good area for the Ordo to meet, the town council to meet. Could be completely wrong on that, but at least it's a nice sort of narrative as to what these structures were when we're looking at this area in Pompeii. Again, just giving you some indication of the niches themselves. So presumably this would have been there for displaying of the imperial elites, such various emperors, might have been elites within Pompeian society that were exemplars for the people that were there. We just don't know, unfortunately, because an awful lot of the statutory has been lost and removed over time because of various things. The earthquake in 62 AD, but ultimately the earthquake itself. And I already said to mention these were excavated quite early, so things did get moved around a lot. But particularly after the earthquake, a lot of stuff was removed and was being repaired. So that's just showing a bit of the fancy floor, which some of it has been replaced. So putting Marcus Holconius Rufus into context in relation to this. So I've already showed you this, and it's quite a nice inscription. Could be a bit prettier, but such is life. And that I've already referred to about him being a Dumver, important individual in relation to this. He's following through on what the town councillors is telling him to do. He's the one who's really in charge. Himself and this other chap, Postumus, were in charge, but they're been given 3,000 sesterces to build a wall as part of the colony. So this has been found in the Temple of Apollo in 1817. It has been dated, as put down here because I'll always forget, to around 10 BC to 85. But that's experts would know how to date these things. I would find it quite difficult myself. There's another inscription, not exactly sure where this one was found, but seems to have been a nicer edition of the inscription I've just shown you, much neater in terms of the engraving of the inscription, but that's something I wasn't able to find. But the Temple of Apollo is located to the western side of the Forum. It's an unusual position in that it's not located perpendicular, it's actually parallel to the Forum. And something I just remember, which I forgot to mention, all the buildings I mentioned, those administrative buildings, seem to have been built and established during the Augustan period. So it seems to be quite a dramatic time in terms of building, not just those buildings, but the Imacia building, and another building that's been set up for the Temple of Augustus further up, and the Forum area really does seem to become consolidated and become a very public space in terms of public buildings during the Augustan period. So this was established in the 2nd century BC, excavated in 1870. An interesting building. It has its own sort of precinct walls around it. So we'll be thinking about what walls might be talking about that Holconius Rufus was dealing with. So the Temple of Apollo, its main entrance, or at least the frontal entrance, is on the Via Marina, which is one of the main entrances going into Pompeii. Obviously, given the name itself, is coming from the sort of sea area. But if we follow through the Via Marina, it's going on to the Via de Abundanza, which is the main sort of thoroughfare of Pompeii. So as I said to the entrance, there are other entrances coming from the Forum, but this is where we really get a look at how the more impressive facade of the temple itself. This is the entrance into it. You can see the walls themselves, they would have been painted, but it's very sort of in some ways they're sort of imposing. It's very much and showing, giving the impression of restricted space. And then up towards the end of the road, you can see moving over towards into the Forum itself, and just you might touch over there slightly to left-hand side. You'll see the Eumachia building that I talked about before. So this is the entrance. You can see an altar in the front, the steps going up into the actual, I was going to say theatre, the temple itself. I liked looking at these old images. Well, not what is an image? Drawings. You can see this is from early excavations, and see it looks quite impressed going through. You can see some of the decoration, paint decoration over on the right-hand side. So unfortunately, all that's been lost through the passage of time. Moving into the sort of precinct area, the temple itself would have been quite impressive. But getting back to the topic that I wanted to really talk about is this wall itself. And where is that? So there's 4 walls, I suppose 4 main walls. So having a look at those in turn, maybe it could have been the front wall. Now, it doesn't seem to have been the front wall. They seem to be dating back to antiquity. I'm not sure what the marble structure is over there to the right-hand side, but it certainly isn't a fridge has been thrown away with had an inscription on it saying "Please take." So it's not the front area. And we can't, looking at the entrance area, but looking from the inside area, it doesn't seem to have been a reconstruction, this taking place during the Augustan period. It might have been a wall that's adjacent to the Forum area. Again, doesn't seem to be the case. That seems to be dated back to antiquity. This is probably one of the more quintessential postcards from Pompeii, but these walls do seem to be quite old. So it doesn't seem to be that area, the Forum area itself. And as I said, this is time, the Augustan period when it seems the Forum area seems to have been reasonably well established. Maybe it is in the northern part, and in some ways, it is quite possible that it might have been the northern area. You can see there is some levels of constructions taking place here because the plaster work has been taken away, different types of stonework. You can see brickwork also incorporated within this. But remember, we are also dealing with the period of the earthquake as well that might have had an impact. So it is possible it might have been the northern wall. I don't want to fully dismiss that. But over towards the western side, we have a domestic building. And if you remember, the inscription said about taking away light from a private dwelling. So maybe it is the dwelling over to the left-hand side. And that seems to be quite possible. And this is taking an image I'll be looking at towards the right-hand side of this particular image. This is an image that's taken from the actual temple itself. This is the casa that I'm talking about. So this wall itself does seem to look like it has been reconstructed at some stage, and there's various stages in which this could have taken place. The crane in the background is not there to reconstruct the wall. It's somewhat quite distance away from Pompeii, but you can see above the wall, you can see parts of the private dwelling on the opposite side. So just putting that into perspective, the Temple of Apollo and the Casa Triquellamalio over there on the other side of it. So it has various different entrances into it. It's not necessarily straightforward. What we do see is a development of private dwellings, incorporation and joining up and linking in. So sometimes it'll have several entrances. So this is within the house itself, and we can see the Temple of Apollo on the opposite side. Just trying to put those into perspective with each other, but some of you might already have noticed there is a double wall that's separating the Temple of Apollo and this particular house. Again, just to making that obvious to you. So I would suggest, and most other people would suggest, so I'm not coming up with it uniquely myself, that the wall that they're talking about here, that Marcus Rufus was involved with, Holconius Rufus was involved in, is probably this wall there. So that seems fairly possible. It's nice here. We can see a little bit of debris there to make it even more dramatic. Vesuvius in the background, but you can see the gap in that wall. Already mentioned about, it's been reconstructed, but this wall was damaged in 1944 during Allied bombing of the area of Pompeii. It wasn't directly on Pompeii, it was accidental, but, it did cause a certain level of damage. So when we're looking at the wall again, we do need to be cautious about how much reconstruction, modern consolidation is involved when we're looking at walls in Pompeii. So that seems a fairly plausible argument to me, and I was going along with that idea. But then I came across John Dobbins's excavation of the sanctuary in Pompeii. Now he's done a few test pits, not just him, but a few other people. And we can see, if you just look at the area of the Temple of Apollo, you can see a road network. So because I've been looking at this for a while, I'll give the impression that everyone else has been looking at the same. Like you can see the road networks around the Temple of Apollo seem to be different. There weren't any road networks around the Temple of Apollo. So the suggestion is, from these sort of test pits that were done, is that these roads were removed to make the area of the Temple of Apollo a much more isolated sanctuary. So this is what it looks like today. So you can see the double wall that I already mentioned to you, but it would have had an impact on the wall in the northern part, which I mentioned a bit earlier on. So hence, it could possibly have been that wall. And this is the difficulty of trying to link inscriptions or even literary sources to archaeological remains. But certainly the area around the Temple of Apollo does become much more isolated. So this also seems to be taking place during the reign of Augustus. So one of the reasons why I'm spending quite a bit of time talking about the sanctuary of Apollo is seen as, or at least Augustus saw it as, one of his main deities. Augustus in the city of Rome introduced the first temple of Apollo in the city of Rome. So perhaps Marcus Holconius Rufus and the town councils involved in this to show their deference to Augustus, their solidarity to Augustus by making this temple as serene as possible and putting more effort into the actual temple itself. Another temple that would be significant would be Temple of Venus. Venus is also connected with Augustus, not just with Sulla. So I think it's quite interesting. There's all this sort of building activities that's taking place during the Augustan period. So this is the forum area. The other dramatic area in which Marcus Holconius Rufus is involved in. There's a big difference between what he's dealing with in relation to the Temple of Apollo, and that's at the behest of the city town council. But in the temple district, he seems to be more getting involved in more private activities. What I'm going to focus on is the large theatre, which should be fairly clear, and that is the largest theatre. A seating capacity of around 5,000. This was built originally in the 2nd century BC. I know it's written there, but it does get changed in the Augustan period, and this is when Marcus Holconius Rufus gets involved. Again, another nice early image of the theatre itself when it was close to the time when it was originally excavated. This is from Google Earth. And we have 2 inscriptions, and this refers to Marcus Holconius Rufus, but another one, Marcus Holconius Keller. Who's this? That's a bit of a discussion, but clearly they're related. They're both the Holconii family, and it's been suggested 2 different things. This might have been the younger brother of Marcus Holconius Rufus. I'd like to go along with that idea. He might have been a son, possibly a nephew, but I think it's probably more than likely that he's going to be his younger brother. So it refers to here that they're doing through their own expenses repairs to the crypt, boxes, and theatre seating. Now these are quite impressive inscriptions, as I said, well over 6 meters long. And this is one of those inscriptions. If you go to the museum in Naples, you'll see it there. I quite like this image because the gentleman standing there, who we probably already figured out that's supposed to be Marcus Holconius Rufus, is almost like he's pointing to that. So it's quite a dramatic statement, and that's a public statement that was set up in the actual theatre itself because they're commemorating the activities they're involved with. There's another nice little inscription, smaller, but this refers to Marcus Artorius Primus, who was a freedman of Marcus. So it looks like, I'm assuming, Marcus Holconius Rufus had his own architect, and he was involved in redesigning the theatre itself. So, and this is just a nicer image of that. The one there, this one you'll see actually in situ in Pompeii, reconstruction of it, and this is the original that you'll see in the museum in Naples. So, what was going on in the actual theatre itself? The theatre itself, as said, was already built in the 2nd century BC and would have been following the Greek model, but needs to be changed into the more Roman model. And that's a movement away into more D-shaped structure. And we can see some of the seating that would have been changed here, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So you can see it's been over the years been levels of reconstructions and consolidation. The modern seating here, the what's not in marble, because they do still use this as an active theatre, which is really quite nice. And bring back Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar. Now, he introduced a law, the Lex Julia Theatris. It's been suggested, different dates around 8 BC or AD 5, but this relates to the seating area. And there's a mention of it by Suetonius, and he refers to a senator in Pozzuoli who gets pushed out of a seat. This was a shock because the front area should have been there for the actual elite, which is about senators, but really the town council, but the really sorts of aristocratic levels within theatres. So Augustus was upset by this story, and just to put them into perspective, Pozzuoli is quite close to Pompeii. So maybe it's following through on this law whenever it came in, but ultimately it is about segregation and social hierarchy in existence in theatres, not just in theatres, but also places of entertainment such as amphitheatres. So it's divided up into three different sections. Now, I'm not really good at sort of technology, but this is just to give you an indication of it. The Imma Cavia is where the sort of senators, the elite would have been. The media would have been where most of the sort of wouldn't say middle class, but the majority of the population and up the top area might have been where the women were put or slaves would have been put. So there is a gender segregation that takes place as a result of it. How much this is enforced, I don't know, but we can see clearly in relation to the seating itself, there is differentiation that is taking place. So it looks like part of what Marcus Holconius Rufus and his brother was getting involved in was trying to follow through on this Augustan model. This gives a further indication as to those sort of divisions within the seating area. But I think it's quite an interesting link. It might be a further digression, but to the west of the theatre itself, we've got the triangular forum. You can just about see the outline of a temple there. This is a temple possibly of Minerva or Hercules. Hercules was seen as one of the sort of founding fathers of Pompeii. But this is just to give again the proximity of them to each other. It's quite a substantial area, different sort of orientation to the theatre itself. But what is interesting is if you're taking the entrance into the triangular forum, this is when it's closer to, I think it was the 1940s, this image was taken. You can see it's quite open. Now it's quite a nice retreat with lots of trees, to shelter when it's quite sunny. But the important bit is that I'm trying to point out is that there is a link between the temple triangular forum and entrances into the actual theatre complex itself. And this is to marking out the three different entrances. Quite a number of entrances people could be migrating from either or exiting, I suppose, from the theatre into the triangular forum. But you can see other entrances going into the theatre complex area itself. So there does seem to be a link, as I said. It also has, as a theatre, have its own sort of precinct, but you might just see through the columns a marble base. And that marble base, not too much information is placed on it, but in this case, it refers to Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who is the patron of Pompeii. So you can see, obviously, Sulla has moved on. We have a new patron of Pompeii. Marcellus, the name Marcellus might ring a bell for some of you, but he is a nephew of Augustus and was thought to be a successor, or thought ultimate successor of Augustus. And he seems to be patron of Pompeii between 25 and 23 BC. Unfortunately, the latter part here, as it says, he caught an illness and died. So he ultimately doesn't become a successor of Augustus. But Marcellus, this is the area where he died, again, quite close to Pozzuoli, quite close to Pompeii. This one, the actual location of this Brasea, is now underwater, and I think it's quite an interesting image, and hence I included that. But we have a bust of Marcellus, and this has been found in the area, possibly in the theatre of, or the Temple of Venus, or in a house quite close to it. It's not when you look at this, it's not a dramatic hairstyle for that particular period. That's meant to be a toga that's over his head. This is where it was located, the Temple of Venus, and I'll come back to mention the Temple of Venus a little bit later on. I mentioned it quite a bit when I was talking about Eumachia and the priestesses in relation to that. But it's quite close in proximity in relation to the theatre of Pompeii. But Marcellus seems to be an important individual because he is ultimately, I suppose, the representative of the Emperor Augustus in Pompeii, or at least there's a connection, so he would have a special interest into it. But Marcellus is more famous ultimately for the theatre of Marcellus in Rome. This is built long after he's passed away, and Augustus dedicates this structure to him. Substantial building, still around today. People actually live on the top, and I'd love to see what some of the interior of these places are like. It went through a long period of which different uses. Again, I like these old images. What I particularly like is you can see there was a lower part were used as shops. So, it's a very big and dramatic building. I appreciate it's a digression, but these are my little interests. The gentleman there who has his hands on his hips, that's Mussolini, where he's cleaning up the site and getting it more fitting into not just the Roman Empire, but ultimately his new empire. So perhaps what we see here, I'm not trying to suggest is a direct link in that, there was a mimicry of the theatre in Pompeii, but they're paralleling taking place within Rome itself in terms of segregation, but also some of the architectural aspects to it. And I think that's why one of the reasons why I'm making that connection to the actual inscription in the triangular form. So, as I said to you, this is the inscription itself, 6 meters long. This is the opposing side. So it would have been two parts of the theatre where they wanted people to see the work that they've done and the money they've invested in this theatre at their own expense. So looking at these, I talked a little bit about the seating area, and that should be fairly clear. But just towards the left-hand side, you can see a sort of small squared off area where just quite close to where that looks like some sort of white shutter is. This is where the sort of would be I can't remember what it's called. Where the important people of Pompeii would have been located. Not just the important people, really important people, special guests. You can imagine maybe the people that are involved in paying for the actual dramatic events that are taking place. Almost like a tribunal area. And the front area there, that's possibly where the inscription would have been placed. So one place there and one place on the opposite side. So these would have been a sort of quite a dramatic space, a very segregated space, almost like sort of royal boxes that you see in modern theatres in the areas of London or wherever. The crypt area, or this is the sort of seating for the lower levels of society, perhaps. Again, it's very impressive architecturally. What you're probably wondering what the pillars are at the back. This would have been for supporting tent-like roofing to shade the inhabitants that were sitting during the theatre events. And this is just one of the entrances into the crypt area, but the seating would have been above it. So again, very impressive in terms of architectural evolution. Again, just a little bit into the interior area of itself. So this is an aerial view of it. So you can see quite a dramatic change has taken place in Pompeii as a result of Holconius Rufus and his brother. So it would have been a substantial investment, and the theatre area must have been a very important part in Pompeii, not just for entertainment, but probably also a political area and political activities. So what does Marcus Holconius do in his spare time? One of the things he also does is a flamena of Caesar Augustus, which is a priest of Caesar Augustus. So you can see his clear link that he's trying to get involved. This is, remember, something about the Pompeian aristocracy. So he's showing that dramatic connection, not in terms of just what he's doing in terms of theatre, but also a priest of Augustus. Now, we're not necessarily sure exactly where this temple of Augustus would have been. It might have been somewhere along the Forum area, but he would have been involved in that. And again, I don't know how many priests there would have been, but he would have been a priest for life. So, but his title does change over time. It moves away and sacerdote, where he becomes, it seems more a different term for the priest of Augustus. Now, there's been some suggestions that this is a change in hierarchy, but when we can see about the positions that he's had within the political forum, it does seem to be this is a later designation in relation to the priest. So again, something to think about. What about his brother? His brother was not only involved in that, but he also does become a priest. In this case, referring to him exactly in the same way in which Marcus Holconius Rufus is. But later on, we can see it changing in the terminology from priest, but it's a priest of the divine Augustus. So the suggestion is that Marcus Holconius Rufus would have been a priest of Augustus during Augustus's life, and he would have passed away at some stage before Augustus. Whilst Holconius Sorelli, he would have continued in the position of a priest of Augustus during once Augustus has passed away. So it just shows in this, that these two individuals from the same family are heavily involved in a connection, not just politically, but also in the religious aspect. It's not necessarily the separation that we might see nowadays in relation to these priestly roles and the roles in relation to governance. A further example of that. In this case, he refers not only to his position in relation to the priest of Augustus, but he's also become the highest level of Dumver in relation to he's involved in the census. So he's achieving similar levels to his brother, but not quite on that level. So he never surpasses Marcus Holconius Rufus in relation to his political activities in Pompeii. So again, how would the people of Pompeii sort of say, thanks, you've done a great job, and commemorate these individuals for what they've done for the inhabitants? One of those, I've already showed you this a bit earlier on, is to put up an inscription, and this inscription is probably somewhere in the staging area and refers to the titles in which Marcus Holconius Rufus is at Dumver for 4 times. That's, as I said, he already surpassed, quite a substantial number of times he's involved that. He's involved at the highest level of that. He's involved in the census. He's also a military tribune by popular demand. So he's not necessarily a military individual, but this seems to be a ceremonial position. It also refers to his position as a priest of Augustus. This inscription is quite unique. It's one of the few sort of coloured marble ones, but this would have been not only would have been on display on the staging area itself. We also have in the flanking areas, they're already mentioned, sort of tribunal areas. This is where the two brothers would have also had put their own names there. So this is just a commemoration that's done by the town councillors. So it's possible that this might have been to the latter part of Marcus Holconius's life. But it's certainly not towards the end. He's probably still involved in different activities. So this is not just something that takes place in Pompeii. Now, this dark image is in Herculaneum. Herculaneum also has a theatre, but unfortunately hasn't been fully excavated, but it's underground. And you can see towards the latter parts, the back of this picture, you can see sort of something that looks a little bit more white, and this is an inscription that has also been set up to commemorate an important individual. And in this case, it's Appius Claudius Pulcher. This individual seems to have been a important individual. He's become a consul in Rome, with the highest political position in Rome. So he comes from Herculaneum, or has a strong connection with Herculaneum. The suggestion is that he was involved, similar thing that was taking place in Pompeii, and sort of rebuilding the theatre and making it more on Augustan lines. But he is, as I said, also politically involved in Rome. Marcus Holconius Rufus doesn't get involved, and the Holconii family doesn't seem to be getting involved in Rome at all. This is on the opposite side, a person called Balbus. There's lots of statues of Balbus on the Balbo in Herculaneum. So he again was an important individual and becomes proconsul, praetor in the first tribune of the plebs in Rome. So these two have strong connections with the city of Rome. So it might suggest something in relation to the status of Herculaneum and Rome that perhaps Pompeii doesn't have, but certainly we can see they're following through in the commemoration. The theatre, I should also have mentioned, the staging area would also have temples, or not temples, statues and inscriptions to, probably there is an inscription to Augustus, but would have been images of the imperial elite from Rome there, which probably would have changed obviously over time. So what is quite interesting is this. Now, this is another inscription that's put into the seating area in the theatre in Pompeii. Originally, it would have had metal infilling to make it even more dramatic. It wouldn't have just painted. It would have had that metal infilling. But, it does seem a bit of an odd spaced inscription that's placed there. But this is the inscription, and it's possible that this might have been done and set up after Marcus Holconius has passed away, because this time you can see he ultimately achieved to become done for 5 times, really quite impressive, and become the sort of the highest level of that twice. So it is really sort of seems to be a summing up of his political engagement and activities within the colony. And as I said to you, this is in the actual seating area. So not only do we see the inscription itself that I mentioned a little bit odd, there's these little holes that are also in the actual seating area, which does need some sort of these, at least these are the ones that I've calculated. I'm looking at the image here. So what were these for? Truth is, I don't know, but there are various suggestions have been made, but also well, the suggestion is that this might be a biscilium, which is a sort of ceremonial seat that's been sort of almost a ward in terms of this a person's positioning. This front area where the elite sat, they would have had their own seats that would have been brought out. The other seating area, people would have sat down and probably had a cushion or something, but these were special seats that were brought out to show how important these individuals were. This is one that reconstruction of one that was, found in Pompeii. So maybe that's what some of the holes might have been for. They're not, they're quite wide seats. So that's, you can see that the name of it almost talks like it's a double seat. So maybe the holes would have been for that. But again, it doesn't necessarily seem to fit in. If you want to commemorate this individual, I've already suggested to you that I think he's passed away at this stage. Um, but I don't know. But there is that square area that's also in the center, and that also takes up some of those holes. So where exactly is that located? And that again brings in one of those issues I already mentioned to you earlier on. The front area is where the elite, the aristocratic members of Pompeii would have sat and had their special seats. Now, it's difficult to see where it is, but hence I've put that arrow. That poor gentleman there is looking at the inscription. It's not located in the front area. It's located in the media cavea. So that would be where the wider population of Pompeii would have sat. So that just seems to be a little bit at odds if you're going to commemorate one of the most important people in Pompeii or past important people of Pompeii. Again, hopefully you can see the sort of inscription that's there. So looking at a few other sort of theatres around the Roman world, you can see sometimes in that sort of central area, there does seem to be a different take in terms of architectural aspects in relation to seating. This is one area in Italy, and the suggestion is that this might have been where an altar might have been set up or a statue to one particular deity. That might seem a little bit of at odds, but if you think back and think about going back into the city of Rome, the first substantial theatre in Rome itself, the theatre of Pompeii, was in the back of that had a theatre, I was going to say a temple of Venus. More dramatically, we see this one here in Merida in Spain. It does seem to be a very special segregated area, which might have been again for some sort of deity. Even more dramatic in this from Turkey, it does seem to be very much a seating area. So the suggestion might be that in Pompeii, this might have been for a small statue for Marcus Holconius Rufus. And certainly that would have been a more dramatic way of commemorating him as an individual in Pompeii, at least in my view. But the truth is we don't really know. But remember, this is stages that, as I said to you, he probably passed away before Augustus passed away. So there is a substantial period in between even Augustus' passing and the destruction of Pompeii in 79 AD. Another further structure in relation to Marcus Holconius Rufus is the Tripolium, the arch of Marcus Holconius Rufus. So some of you might be thinking about, well, what does it mean? What kind of arch are we actually talking about? And it's quite interesting to have an honorific arch in not just in Pompeii, but elsewhere for, shall we say, a private individual, although public figure in the settlement. This is where the original statue of Marcus Holconius was found. He has a special podium there, so he's marking this area. Some of you might be wondering, what do I mean by a tripolium arch? I'm not sure how's the best way to describe this, and hence I'm showing you the image, but it has 4 different entrances or exits. I was going to say 4 different sides, but all arches really ultimately have 4 different sides in most cases. But again, this is coming from Spain. Um, Give you a real indication as to the arches themselves. This is marking what I think probably was a crossroads in this settlement. Hasn't been fully excavated. I don't know the actual role of this one, but I just want to show you this as an actual image to give you an indication as to what an arch would have looked like. So putting that into context, you can see it is the main sort of thoroughfare of Pompeii, the Via Abbastanza, just locating where the theatre of Pompeii, the temple of Apollo is, but also the theatre in Pompeii and the Forum. So not necessarily in the central area, but still a significant area. You can see there's a bit of a change in the dynamics of the road network where it's actually located. What about other arches? There's quite a number of arches in Pompeii, but they're all are linked to emperors. Now, these are sorts of, I'm putting labels onto them, but the labels themselves are a little bit tenuous. But the point is they are linked to emperors, or in most cases, people that are linked, important people linked to the emperor. The Arch of Gaius and Lucius Caesar would have been the possible successors of Augustus himself. These arches only have two different sides to them. Or a traditional arch, so we're up towards the top right. I've also pointed out the Temple of Fortuna Augusta. I'm not sure if this was a temple of Augustus, but this was set up by a private individual during the Augustan period. Looking at the arches in the Forum area, the one that looks a little bit lame is the Arch of Nero because it was removed. He's sort of like damnatio memoriae. It's removed because of what happened to Nero. There is a Tripolium arch in Herculaneum. Unfortunately, again, not fully excavated, but putting that into proximity, a very dramatic arch in how it looks. Certainly even more dramatic and much more solid than the one we see in Spain. What I think is quite nice, and maybe making a link with Pompeii, you can see the statue base here, slightly similar in that it's white and looks nice. And that marks into the Augustonium in Herculaneum, marking either side of the entrances, but this seems to be linked to the imperial elite and part of an architectural facade. It's not a standalone sort of structure that we see in Pompeii. So this does seem to be quite a movement away in terms of commemorating Marcus Holconius Rufus. As I said to you, already mentioned to you about the Via de Abbastanza, the sort of main thoroughfare, and also the Via Stabia, which is another sort of thoroughfare. So it really is sort of almost like a crossing, the main sort of crossing of Pompeii itself, which normally would be in the Forum area, but this is as Pompeii sort of progressed, but still a serious sort of area of crossroads. Located very close to the theatre, the large theatre in which he was involved with, so probably would be quite a good area to commemorate Marcus Holconius Rufus. He probably also had statues in the Forum area, but I'll sort of touch on that again a little bit later on. So this is what I should already mention to you, that how the sort of it's a very sort of unique area in terms of the Via de Abbastanza, sort of spreads out a little bit. It's a truncation between the two different main roads in relation to each other. You can just about see in the central area the podium in which the statue was originally placed. Over towards the right-hand side, you might just about make up one of the other sort of pillars in relation to the arch. So you're probably already starting to think about, well, that seems to be quite wide. Architecturally, would this actually work? Again, not necessarily the best of image, but this coming from Google Earth. But you can see the four different columns of the arch, and they don't seem to be very substantial. This just again giving you an impression about the change in the pathway in relation to the Via d'Abbastanza. If we'd follow through this, it'll take you up to the Forum area. To the right-hand side, that's where the statue of Holconius Rufus was. We don't know who it was on the left-hand side. But it does seem to intrude a little bit on the Via Stabia, but even still, it doesn't. And we can also see there's a change in the dynamics of the route network. That vehicular traffic would have been able to progress. It would certainly have been pedestrians. The structure to the right-hand side is one of the main baths of Pompeii. So probably a good place to commemorate Holconius Rufus. Would have been a lot of people sort of walking around in the particular area itself. So the the pillars themselves don't necessarily seem to align perfectly with each other, as you can see just about here, and even just trying to make this sort of, to make the point again from Google, not brilliant, but you can see seem to be quite insubstantial, quite small, but also very wide. So probably wouldn't have worked in terms of some of the arches, architectural arts I've been trying to suggest to you. Other people suggest that it wouldn't have been as dramatic, but in terms of, you know, masonry, but maybe would have been sort of some sort of wooden canopy over it. Perhaps. Again, I don't know, but the important point is there seems to be some sort of commemoration that's taking place to Marcus Holconius Rufus. So who might have fitted into these spaces? The one there to the left-hand side, that's sort of Marcus Holconius Rufus. Perhaps one of these might have been for his brothers, Keller, which I've already talked about a bit earlier on. So what we see here is perhaps this is a commemoration of the Holconii family and their involvement in the politics of Pompeii over the years. You can see that the actual column behind has been reconstructed. It's again something I'll always be cautious about when we're looking at Pompeii, the level of reconstruction that's taken place. Um, One of the ones I think is quite significant, who I showed a bit before when I talked about Eumachia, is you have this one in the background, which is to Holconia. Holconia is obviously related, but she's a female. There's an inscription that relates to her, and that refers to her being a public priestess. The inscription itself is quite partial, but you know, it seems to be a very impressive inscription. So expense has been put into it. So you could imagine that she being connected to Marcus, I was assuming that she's a daughter. Some other people suggest she might have been a sister, but I like the idea about her being a daughter as a public priestess. So that would have been sort of an easy thing for her to have got involved with, because Marcus Holconius Rufus and his brother were substantial figures within Pompeii. Eumachia was also a public priestess. So these are the position for women, the very top of Pompeian society. And this is possibly what she might have looked like, but we need to be cautious about that. Again, when I talked about Eumachia, when I look at these facial features, they all seem to look exactly the same to me. This is not a statue that was found in situ in this arch area, but it has been attributed to it by various different scholars, probably because they want to put a face to a name, and I'm just following through on that sort of idea. So as I said to you, a lot of these statues have been moved around as a result of 62 AD and the earthquake in Pompeii. So again, we need to be cautious. But then again, I did mention a little bit earlier on that sometimes that within the forum area, there would have been a bit of a cull of statues, because there would have been dignitaries, a change in terms of the emperors and the imperial family would have resulted in changes that are taking place in the forum area. But she's not just involved as a priestess, and this is where I think it's quite interesting. So again, a slight digression. I'm going to take you slightly outside Pompeii to one of the necropolises, one of the burial areas outside Pompeii, and take you to the Fondo Specifico. Not an area that a lot of people will visit, but when we're looking at re-excavation of this, that's been taking place over the last few years. Not a brilliant image, but what we see here is Holconia, daughter of Marcus, and it's probably likely this is our Holconia that we're talking about. She seems to be the owner of a tile making or brick making factory. So she is an active person involved in the industry, and like Eumachia, seems to have a high level of independence. So she's certainly involved not just in the religious aspect, but in the industrial aspect. So this is an interesting dynamic when we're looking at genders in relation to Pompeii during the Augustan period. This is another tile, a brick that's stamped with her name on it. Unfortunately, I don't know where this came from, but it's in the museum in Naples. But the other one, at least we know that this is tiles that have been involved in some of the burial efforts. So she would have been actively involved. When talking about Eumachia, I think her husband was involved in the tile making industry, I think. But again, she is actively involved in the dynamics of Pompeii. So I just think that makes a little bit interesting in relation to moving to the actual inscription itself in relation to this. This is listing out what I've already suggested to you in relation to the seating area in Pompeii. So this would suggest to me this commemoration after Marcus Holconius Rufus has passed away, and is dated to around the first century AD, or maybe so it should be 11th century AD. So probably a little bit late. We don't exactly know when he passed away. It's a nice inscription self commemorating all those positions I already mentioned to you about as patron of the colony itself. But looking at the actual statue itself, this is a further interesting dynamic in looking at the evidence in relation to Pompeii. So the statue, quite dramatic. You can see it almost looks very imperial. The position over on the one image over on the right hand side is just I quite like to see the backs of the statue. So it's obviously been done in the round, or at least there's been quite a lot of effort has been put into the back part of it. So it's not just that it would have been positioned up against a wall where people wouldn't see. They are cautious about trying to do as much as they can in relation to the statue itself. Again, it's not necessarily as good as the front area, but you can see the effort that's been made into the statue itself. You can also see a little bit split on the top part of the neck. So the neck and the body itself was separated at some stage now, and that's the point I'm going to return to a little bit later on. The suggestion is that this is actually a statue of Caligula, and not the face, but this is a statue of Caligula that has been reused by Marcus Holconius Rufus, or I would suggest some of his relatives afterwards. So there has been a result of a removal of the statue of Caligula and changed into one to Marcus Holconius. So this would suggest it's quite late. It's quite possible that the inscription itself might have been removed from the forum area, possibly, and taken over here. It might be a little bit later, we just don't know. But I'm trying to give the impression that there's quite a lot of movement that's taking place in Pompeii. So we get some sort of dates as to when Caligula was at reign. So it's obviously later than this actual part. How do we know this is Caligula? And this is where I have to bow to those people who know these things better than I. But you can look at it's the face itself seems to be Marcus Holconius Rufus. I'm quite impressed they would have known what he might have been looked like, but there would have been ways of recording that. But it's the hair at the rear of the statue which you can see. That has been suggested that this is what Caligula's hair would have looked like. You can see, and what they've done is, and if you look at the statue quite closely, you can see the head is actually a bit disproportionate to the body. It's quite a small head. So the head has been removed and sculpted into that of Marcus Holconius Rufus. The facial features, while the rear bit, you know, is been sort of a little bit left as to what Caligula would have been like. The breastplate in relation to, as I mentioned here, seems to be quite close to the cult of the statue of Mars Ultor from the Forum of Augustus. So it does seem to further link into that sort of Augustan links that Caligula was following through. But it fits in with that little bit I talked about that military aspect. But as far as we know, Marcus Holconius Rufus was never involved in the military aspects. It seems to be commemoratorial position. But it's possible that they are using this statue as a sort of to big up Marcus Holconius Rufus, or at least his ancestors were. And you can see very impressive decoration in relation to that. So the reason they're able to use or reuse this because Caligula himself, you know, suffered damnatio memoriae because of his activities that had taken place, and people tried to forget about that. So why not actually reuse the statue itself? So as I already mentioned, there's quite a lot of movement of statues. So what I'm trying to suggest is that after Marcus Holconius passed away, somebody in the family probably decided that, you know, that they would like to commemorate him further. The commemoration remains within the theatre, but the forum area seems to be quite dynamic. There's some sort of there is an inscription that we know from Marcus Holconius that's reused in another statue base. So probably his family came together as relatives to commemorate the sort of most dynamic political period in which Marcus Holconius Rufus, to big them up for the future. Another aspect of fitting into that sort of narrative of Marcus Holconius Rufus is his house. And this structure has been identified, really talking about between the sort of red brick element, that doorway there, that's been referred to as his house. Now, obviously, a substantial period of time has elapsed between the passing of Marcus Holconius Rufus, but also Augustus. So it's unlikely that this would have actually been his house, but it might have been passed on through different successors. But even still, we need to be quite skeptical of that. What is the evidence for that? It really is down to its location and proximity to the Arch of Holconius Rufus and the theatre area that I've just talked about. Um, there's nothing inside that can be connected to Marcus Holconius Rufus. There's absolutely nothing there. The structure itself is probably one of the more dramatic, bigger structures in that immediate area. It's not the largest house in Pompeii, but even still, the rooms that are surrounding the actual peristyle area seems to be quite small. But still, it is an impressive structure. And you can see it's given different names, such as the Casa dei Postium. So it's and that's at least based upon electoral graffiti or graffiti in the exterior. So you need to be cautious about the names that are attributed to an awful lot of houses in Pompeii. It's just trying to give that sort of lived-in experience. But in reality, whether you can connect graffiti in the front of a dwelling to the people who actually lived inside, I'm quite dubious about that, as most other people would be. But it does fit into that sort of trying to populate and people these actual buildings themselves. But again, goes back to the point is Marcus Holconius Rufus probably passed away and would have gone through different generations. Even though it's possible it might have stayed within the family, but again, we don't necessarily know. The other thing that's unfortunate in relation to Marcus Holconius Rufus, he certainly made a dramatic imprint on Pompeii itself, is we don't know where he's buried. And there's quite impressive burials in the surrounding areas of Pompeii, but we've got no evidence as yet of where he was buried or the Holconii themselves might have been buried. It doesn't seem to be a family plot. So I've talked about three individuals in relation to the Holconii family, but the Holconii family does continue after Marcus Holconius Rufus. Gellius here during the reign of Augustus, where he becomes a Dumvir, dates to around 2 to 23 BC. A further one, Marcer, he seems to be not necessarily reaching that high level and position as his previous generations, but is involved as a praefectus in relation to under the reign of Caligula. There is some suggestion that he sort of dirtied his bib as a result of association with Caligula. Again, depending on the scholars that you read, but that's possible and might explain why there's no sort of Holconii really involved in politics for a substantial period of time. Again, it fits into that sort of quite nice dramatic narrative, but again, there isn't really sufficient evidence to support that. Priscus does seem to be the last of the Holconii that we have evidence for. Most of these will come from electoral graffiti, which I haven't talked about, outside structures around Pompeii. The reason why that doesn't seem to be referring to Marcus Holconius Rufus and the rest of the family is because the evidence itself has been lost. Much of the evidence for electoral graffiti dates to post the earthquake in 62 AD, but there are some beforehand. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have all the evidence for the various people who are striving towards becoming a magistrate. In this case, referring to him trying to become aedile. This is outside a shop area. Aedile, I mentioned he was the lower level of the magistrate, so we can see some sort of efforts in terms of that political progression. So once you become aedile, you could become a Dumvir later on and become part of the Ordo. So that's certainly what he's trying to achieve, Priscus is trying to achieve. This another one, unfortunately, it says it's been lost, but at least there's some sort of reconstruction of that. And this is referring to fruit sellers coming together. Remember, I mentioned it a little bit earlier on about not necessarily looking at it in a democratic way, but different groups sort of pushing towards their candidates. But in this case, we can see fruit sellers are involved in trying to push him to become Dumvir. So he's obviously become aedile and was successful, but he's looking towards becoming that highest level in political office and following through in the likes of Marcus Holconius Rufus. And a further one here, again, impressive, just the graffiti, because didn't want you to miss out on seeing the sort of electoral graffiti when we talk about politics in Pompeii. It's not just about inscriptions. Again, this is referring to him trying to become in partnership of becoming the Dumvir in Pompeii. You can see very unfortunately quite faded, but still these electoral things were very impressive when they originally excavated, and very neat and very impressive. So we don't know whether it was a success in becoming Dunver, because unfortunately the eruption takes place. It's quite possible he might have, but he's one of the sort of last sorts of political elements in relation to Pompeii. So in some ways, when I'm looking at the Holconii family, I'm sort of been looking at it a little bit in reverse. So I'm looking at the highest level in success in relation to the Holconii family, and you can see a hiatus perhaps in relation to their involvement in it, and then ultimately rebuilding in relation to the Holconii family in relation to politics. But when we're looking at politics, it probably was going to be largely controlled by the older established aristocratic families. There would have been new people coming in from time to time, but as I said, there wouldn't have been that core area. Now, I'm taking you back a little bit, looking at this reference to Cicero, but this recorded in Macrobius and Saturnalia, which I think is 2nd century AD. So we don't see this in any of Cicero's writings, but this is before the imperial period. But he's referring to the activities, political activities in Rome itself. It's quite easy to become consul, but in Pompeii it's quite difficult. This is just one recording, but it would seem to fit in with the dynamics that we see in terms of electoral graffiti in relation to Pompeii itself, quite active. How similar this was elsewhere, we don't know. How accurate this is, the opinion of Cicero is, we don't know, but it certainly gives an interesting view on how we look at Pompeii itself. So I think that's really most of the points I want to make. And certainly Marcus Holconius Rufus is an impressive individual in relation to Pompeii. Certainly seems to be the most successful individual of all those that we see in Pompeii, at least in relation to the evidence itself. So thank you very much for being with me this evening. Obviously, I'd like to thank Jackie and Bob Dunn, because they're the images that I've grabbed most of this. But I'd also like to say thank you very much for Cheryl for her patience in relation to supporting the activities in relation to the LRAC, or the Arts and Humanities Society.